Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us. This is the LinkedIn Live. And today we are hosting a really good fun session. This is Ask a Podcaster. So there's 3 podcasters right here on your screen, and we're going to be chatting about some different platforms, some different tools, different bits and pieces to do with podcasting. If you are joining us live, please do type a question to the side of the screen, probably that side, maybe that side. Type a question, it will pop up here, and we'll do our best to answer it as we go. If you're watching this on repeat, then still please do ask a question, because the comment will appear under the video, and then one of us 3 can dive in and we can keep that conversation going. So who are we? Well, my name is Simon Batchelor. I'm one of the co-founders of Better, Bolder, Braver. We run an online community where we offer coaches marketing, training and support. I'm also a podcaster. I host a couple of podcasts and also edit a few podcasts for different clients. And I, for about 10 years, worked in the world of TV, commercials and film and television, doing various sound-related tinkering. So that is my audio background. And today I'm joined by Mark and Rob. So Mark, do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Thank you. Hi, I'm Mark. I run a company called Origin, which is, on the face of it, it's podcast production and consultancy with a little bit of education thrown in. But what it is increasingly for me is helping the people I work with and their audiences kind of build love affairs. So I'm really getting fascinated with how we can effectively build these incredible relationships between the audiences and the people that are serving those audiences, and so I try and help that with through the work that I do as a producer, but also working one-on-one with people. I had a background in tech, and I ran a media hosting company for a while, and then I escaped so that I could work more closely with people on a one-to-one basis, and it's the best move I ever made. Rob.
Thanks, Mark. I'm fascinated by Mark's introduction there. There are things I didn't know about Mark. There are things I didn't know about Mark there that I've just learned. So that's another conversation for another time. That's what's so great about podcasting. Hey, we learn these things and then we inspire another conversation to have at another time. So I wear a variety of hats, most of which in some shape or form end up in the world of podcasting. So I come from, similar to Mark and Simon, I come from a tech background and also come from a coaching background, been in the coaching space for about 15 years now. And then in the last 10 or so years, a lot of work in the podcasting world. And I spend most of my time these days, I am a podcast host, but I spend more time these days supporting others to help them realize their sort of podcasting aims. And most, if not all of those people in some shape or form are in the personal and professional development space or realm. So it's really exciting for me to be able to just spend most days every day speaking with people, working with people, helping them produce content and audio that I know is going to have a ripple effect that goes out into the world and is going to improve our small planet in some way. So I have the pleasure of listening to anything from a podcast on skincare to a business podcast that's all about scaling, companies and how to do that sustainably and effectively. So it's hopefully that's a bit of an insight as to what I do. My own podcast is called Inspirational Creatives. So it's probably ought to mention that. And I do quite a lot of work with folks like the Association for Coaching. We've got an amazing series there where we've just popped over 100 episodes and we're celebrating 20 years of that organization. So that's a lot of fun.
Yeah. Excellent. Thanks, Rob and Mark. I think, we've got a sort of quite a wide range of backgrounds in terms of how we actually ended up in front of and or behind the microphone. But I think one of the things that I wanted to do in this session, and the reason I kind of invited you to join this session, is because there's a lot of questions that we get asked by coaches predominantly, because that's sort of the spheres in which we operate and overlap, around starting a podcast. But also there are a lot of people who maybe have done like maybe 6 episodes of a podcast or 10 episodes of a podcast, and have either sort of paused it for a bit or have kind of run out of steam with it. And I think there's also, on the other side of that, there's some really exciting noise around podcasting. There's some really sort of let's say some sort of positive tools coming out, and some people making some quite big promises out there around podcasting. And I think it would be interesting to start in kind of a couple of exciting tools that I've seen and hear talked about a lot more recently as a kind of alternative to that sort of record your podcast and then throw it onto iTunes and Spotify using an aggregation tool or a hosting tool, and then sort of having to do the get people out of their headphones into your inbox bit yourself. So I think there's tools like Captivate, Transistor, is that one? Is it Transistor? Yeah. Anchor. There's a number of, I mean, there's loads of tools, and you've probably got one if you've already got a podcast, and you basically upload your recordings. Acast is another big one. You upload it, and then they then put it on all of the platforms for you. But I guess one of the things that keeps coming up, I think, for quite a lot of different coaches is it's like, okay, that's great. I'm putting those episodes out and people are listening. Like I can see on the stats, people are listening. But how do I get them to then engage with more of my content or start a conversation? Or how do I kind of keep that conversation going? How do I enable those people who are curious and want to know more to take that next step? So there's a couple of tools that I'll throw into the ring, one of which is Substack and the other of which is Ghost, that I'm hearing mentioned more and more. So, Mark, do you have any thoughts on either of those platforms, or kind of what that process I was talking about? Any ideas about how you might enable that or make it easier?
Yeah. So for anyone who isn't aware, Ghost and Substack are effectively newsletter tools. So Substack came to prominence a few years ago as a super simple start a newsletter. It works like a blog, very simple to write a post and then get it out to your subscribers. You can also read within the app. So a little bit like Medium, they're trying to create their own little ecosystem, but you own your subscriber list, and email is how it is primarily delivered. So unlike Medium, which is just this blog, Substack is a newsletter. They are also they're adding media hosting into that as well. So you can throw up your audio file, make it part of your post. So effectively, you could do a newsletter that is also a podcast, and so you upload the audio version of that, and then that can be played. You tap it on the email, and it'll open up on the website and stuff. And then Ghost started in 2013, 2014, maybe a little bit earlier, as a competitor to WordPress, as a much simpler, just blogging platform. And then I think they saw the way the tide was shifting, and they've basically kept the software the same, but they've migrated it over time to be much more like Substack. So with Ghost, unlike Substack, so Substack has a perfectly free tier, and I think it's free as long as you don't want to charge. If you do want to charge people for access to your newsletter, which you can, then or your podcast, then I think Substack will take a fee. Ghost, it's very simple. Like, get a subscription, you sign up. You can run it yourself if that's something that you want to do, or if you have a friendly nerd who can help you install Ghost. It's a nightmare. Don't do it. You can also just go to ghost.org and they'll do it all for you, and they'll handle it. And they're a really good team, and it's really nice software. They don't currently do the media hosting, but they do make it really easy to embed audio. So if you are on Anchor or somewhere else that's hosting your media files, then it's actually pretty trivial to implement that. And so that is where you start to get that relationship building with your listeners, because podcast subscribing, following is anonymous. And so what we really want to do to be able to get those conversations moving is to invite people to subscribe to some kind of a newsletter or for updates. And so those are two really good tools that will help you. Captivate integrates. So Captivate is a media host. They integrate with a few services like Aweber. It's one of their favorites, but they'll do, I think, MailChimp and one or two others as well. So if you're used to using those tools, you've got the same kind of thing, and they will integrate it into the website that they build for you. So they'll give you a little pop-up. So straight away, if people are there on your episode details page, or if they've clicked through from LinkedIn, they can go straight into seeing a prompt to subscribe to your newsletter.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think it's definitely sort of, it feels like saying a gap in the market feels like something I'm saying way too late. Like it's definitely, it was a gap in the market that they've taken the most of, but I think it's something that increasingly people are thinking about, because there are, as we well know, a lot of podcasts about all of the topics. So there's no shortage of podcasts, but I think it is that element. This is what we talk about a lot, and what I spoke to you on your podcast about, Mark. It's that creating that Netflix of you, isn't it? And just allowing someone to binge through all of your thoughts and ideas before they go, yeah, I really want to work with this person. So I think having like a media rich website sounds really interesting, because it's, you've got something to read, something to listen, and then you might invite them with a prompt, something to do, which is really good. So that's interesting to know about, just on the technical side, that they're not actually hosting it. Their website doesn't make that at all clear, so that's really interesting.
That may be or may have changed, so I might be wrong, but I know up until recently they weren't doing the actual audio media file hosting, but they were making it sort of very easy to get your hosting service to talk to Ghost. But as I say, that they may well have changed.
Okay. Well, future Simon, after this is finished, will fact check that and leave in the comments as to what is happening.
Yeah, but I mean, the other weird thing is, like, I think I've got a bit more time for Ghost than I have for Substack, purely because, and this will be something to fact check. I've tried to do the fact checking on this, but it's there is a stink around Substack that their content moderation is not what it should be.
Yes, I have heard this.
I've found it very difficult to actually give a concrete example of, all I've found is other people saying this, but there's enough of that stink around that it makes me a little bit uneasy about necessarily recommending Substack. But again, there isn't one article that I can point to say, oh, it is full of, for example, Nazis.
Yes, yeah. They don't seem to be too choosy about who they're having published, but I think that is definitely something that a growing company definitely needs to address. So it'd be interesting to see if they do take any action. I think maybe the fact that you're not able to find the examples means that they are actually taking it down, if the sense that you're not finding the content. But I don't know. I've definitely heard a few people go, Substack, isn't that where insert controversial name here posts their blog? And I'm like, oh, is it? Right. Okay. Maybe I might ease off of that then.
Yeah. And I do know that Ghost are quite happy to, and we're not talking about the big ban hammer coming down if it happens to not be something that they like, but I do know that Ghost are a little bit more, happy to sort of say, oh no, I think you're a baddie.
yeah, not for us, thank you. Yeah. Rob, what's your thoughts on sort of using a tool like this for audience engagement?
Well, I think lots of thoughts there. I mean, there's so much in just what you were both talking about there that we could go into. But I think that at a sort of higher level, what's really important with the folks that I work with, for example, is the mindset behind it all. It's about how you approach these things more so than the tools, because as you're sort of alluding to, and the the fact checks there, the tools come and go. That's been my experience, and they evolve over time. And I would say that actually everyone I work with, they're on the quotes tried and tested tools, if you like, the ones that have been around for quite a long time and they're solid. And there is some, and it's interesting just listening to your sort of dialogue there about Substack and the sort of credibility around that too, because I think that's really important sometimes. The tools you align yourself with, or the platforms that you align yourself with. I mean, it's this thing of, and this is absolutely true for the mindset of podcasting, how you do anything is how you do everything, or at least that's the perception. So, some people who don't really put a lot of care and attention into the quality of their audio, or where they're publishing, or how they're publishing with their audio, particularly as a coach, you might give people who might want to work with you the impression that, well, if they're not really putting the care into that, what are the other corners of their business like in terms of the care and attention? So I think alignment's quite important, and I think that even includes the tools that you use from an ethical point of view. To your new book there, Simon, I think that you might want to your selection criteria of which platforms and tech you choose to use might be an important sort of thought process in terms of your own values and how those companies or organizations are making a difference in the world as well. So it's a bit of a challenge because, as I say, tools, software, platforms come and go, and they evolve. So even the tried and tested ones that I've just mentioned there, they've caught us by surprise. And even very recently, where all of a sudden a feature has moved, changed, or disappeared, or we're publishing tomorrow and suddenly it's not published, and we go back in and the interface has changed. And that's even true for the more solid platforms, which don't have a history of doing that without tremendous amounts of notification and sort of lead time. But I think that's a reflection of the world that we live in today. It's getting competitive in that space. The tools are trying to outcompete each other with features and performance and all the rest of it. And as a content creator, that can be a bit of a challenge to navigate that world. So I think really try and keep it simple. I think that's the sort of fundamental principle I would apply to that. But most importantly, the mindset piece is about how are you going to engage with the people? Who do you want to reach? Where are they? So that you can show up in front of where they already are, is probably more important than the tool itself, even though the tools are important. And then, then what's the means of reaching them? And then try and assess which tools will allow you to do that in a way that works for you.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I think that mindset around just, well, what is it you're actually going to add? It's like, once you've got them there, what are you going to offer them? I think is a big piece of that as well. So
there's a point of that with the newsletter stuff, because one of the things that I do is I audit podcasts and so help people sort of understand where they are with their show and stuff. And one of the things that I'm always doing is looking at the website. It's a key piece of it because it's the home of your podcast. And there's one of the things I'm always looking at is like, if you're encouraging people to sign up to your newsletter, why? Why from the perspective of someone who is potentially going to sign up? Like, what are they going to get? We know what we're going to get. We're going to get your email address, and that's brilliant. But what are they going to get? And we so often, whether it's just because we've implemented a theme on WordPress or dragged something in from Squarespace, we have the default sign up to our newsletter, get the latest updates kind of text, and it's like, we don't think really too much about how we can hold people's hand through that next part of that relationship.
I think that's a great point, actually, Mark, that you make there about the newsletter. And it frequently, again, how you do anything is how you do everything. I've frequently stumbled across a really good podcaster only to find that the website is shocking. And it's just that it's that lack of consistency and sort of follow through in terms of what most people would call the user experience. But it's that relationship. And I think, to a point that you made earlier, Simon, what's becoming more and more important these days is the experience that you create for people and the ecosystem within which they experience that experience, if you like. And I think these days, it used to be that you would have a brand and then a podcast, which might either be a reflection of that brand. It may be branded in the same way, or it might have its own separate brand, but people knew that it was a dotted line that belonged to this overarching sort of brand. But these days, I think a brand has an ecosystem, and within that ecosystem happens to be audio. Even though we're talking about podcasts here, we could be talking about audio more broadly. To Mark's point about, you could have an audio version of a blog post being read out. But then within that ecosystem, you've got a lot of stuff that people can interact and play with. So, they might have blogs to read, videos to watch, and audio to listen to. So it's a kind of a choose your own adventure type experience there, rather than it being this kind of audio, satellite kind of island that's outside of the brand. It's becoming a much more integrated experience, I would say, these days. And perhaps we can talk a bit more about that and some of the trends that are happening towards that later today.
Yeah, I think that's quite interesting because a big brand who I edit the podcast of do exactly that. So they use Acast as their host, and we use the embedded player on Acast to put the podcast in the blog post.
Yeah,
and they get most of their plays from that blog post because that's what they share on LinkedIn. That's what they send out to their email list, and they get people to that blog. And for them, it's great because, of course, then you've got the contact details of those people who are in the podcast. You've got their LinkedIn Connect buttons on the bottom of the blog, and people are like, "Oh, that sounds interesting." They click on the link on LinkedIn, it opens up, and they're like, "Oh, great, I can read it as well." Because some people, they're not always got time to listen, but they're very speedy readers. Whereas other people might be like, "Oh, do you know what? I don't have time to listen to this now." But of course, then the nice thing about the Acast player, and other players are available, is that you've got the ping it, like throw it to Spotify, throw it to iTunes buttons on the player. So you click it and it just pings out to Spotify, and then you can click go. So you're not trapping people in. And of course, you could add your own links on the website, or if you're using one of these sites like Captivate, makes a website, obviously you can just send people to that episode, and there's no reason why you can't put the transcription in, or a long version, do you know what I mean? And it will build a website that looks like that. You don't necessarily have to make your own website in order for all of what we're talking about to work. But I think what's interesting is when you start to look at tools like Substack and Ghost, they're going to that next level. So they're saying, well, actually, rather than just saying to people, here's my podcast episode, you're also saying, well, here's my newsletter, here's a blog I wrote about this. And a phrase that I quite like that Substack uses, read alouds. So they're saying, well, you can do a podcast and you can do a read aloud. And I think that's quite a nice way of sort of differentiating between those two sort of podcast styles. So I'm totally stealing that because that's a really good. I love that word, and I think there's some really fun, like creative things you can do. So at the risk of having things thrown at me, what I'd like to now do is introduce the concept of video with podcasts. I know Mark has fairly strong opinions on this, so we're going to throw straight over to Mark. A lot of pressure is seemingly being applied for people to film their podcasts so they can put it on things like YouTube. Anchor is now encouraging you to upload the video version of your podcast. I've never actually watched a video version of a podcast, so I have no frame of reference as to whether it works. I know there are some big hitters out there who are storming YouTube with it. Mark, thoughts on video as podcast?
Okay. I'm probably not going to be as strident as maybe it would seem, but I think what I have opinions on is the push that this is something that that we sort of need to do ourselves, because there's what I'm increasingly becoming aware of, and this may be where we start. I don't know. I'm sure we won't get into fights about it, but I'm becoming increasingly aware of the sort of noise effect of a lot of marketing and a lot of content marketing. Is it a lot of it can feel like noise, and a lot of it can feel like pushing people towards the next thing, or the I'm sat here scrolling through LinkedIn and now someone wants me to go and listen to this or watch this. It's all quite difficult. Okay, I personally think that, and this is my personal opinion, this is not the opinion of Better, Bolder, Braver. I think part of the push towards video podcasting is pushed by those who have a vested interest in video podcasting. Because at the end of the day, if you're looking at your phone, your eyeballs are potentially then looking at ads. That sounds a lot more cynical and like A-level psychology than I mean it to, but I genuinely think that it's true, because with audio, and where I think the magic of audio is that your phone's away, you're doing other stuff. You're washing the dishes, you're walking the dog, you're taking a bath, you're doing these things where your brain is occupied in a different way. That creates a much more intimate connection between you and the person you're listening to, but it's less monetizable. It's a lot harder to interrupt that process with with an ad that has a visual appeal. That, more importantly, you can tap on straight away, and the companies can track that click through And so I think to a degree, part of that that push is from people who have a vested interest in that being the case. And there are also very, very good reasons why you want to do this. If we talk about watch, read, listen, do, it gives you, for free, sort of that extra thing. You could record your one mic podcast episode, or you could record your interview or your two-hander in Riverside or in Squadcast or on Restream. And then you could that's a video version. Then you can take the audio and you can compress that down, make it a podcast episode. So from the sort of the amount of work that needs to be done to create more content, it's great. What I think you end up doing is creating lots of bits of content that don't quite fit the medium, because it then becomes very easy for us in audio form to when we're on video is to make a reference to something that the listener can't see, or to point out, to say, if you're listening to this as opposed to watching it, and suddenly now I'm alienated because suddenly now I'm not watching it or consuming this content in the way you wanted me to consume it. Now I'm like a second-class citizen because you've just said, if you're listening to this as opposed to watching it, and it's and
but
so
I guess you can also use that in the other way. Like I was listening to the Infinite Monkey Cage the other day, and they were doing the episode on birds. It's way back. You've got to do a bit of finger scrolling on the old BBC Sounds app, but it's well worth a listen because they have a live bird in the studio.
Oh wow!
And it's not filmed, but yet you feel engaged and involved, and that they've literally got a bird flying around the studio eating off all of the different people's heads and hands. It's brilliant, but it's all on the radio and you have to imagine a lot of it. And it was a really interesting experience. I don't know quite how I got onto that, but anyway, the point being that I think exactly, Mark, you in context of audio, you can be right in connected with someone deeply if you're just focusing on that. And that's not to say you can't also record it, but I think you do have to be careful that you don't alienate one way or the other. But yeah, I think you've hit exactly on the point, which is that repurposing content and watch, read, listen, do. And I think if you do it right, you can use both. You can use the video and audio in both their formats on different channels, and maybe just recording different tops and tails is a nice way of setting people up and doing the ask at the end maybe. But yeah, that's interesting. What are your thoughts, Rob?
It's a fascinating debate that's always been around in my experience with podcasts, but the nature of the debate has changed, and the nature of the relationship between video and audio has changed. And I wholeheartedly agree with Mark's points there about audio being a unique experience in the sense of how you engage with those that are sharing their conversation with you. It is a psychologically and physically, it's a different experience, emotional experience, when you're just listening to the emotion and the passion and the sentiments that are coming through somebody's voice without any of the visual distraction. And even science goes so far as, when we've got that visual distraction in front of us, our relationship to the audio changes. So we'll miss some of those subtleties. Coaches that know the difference between in-person and telephone coaching will understand what Mark and I are perhaps talking about there. So it's a very different experience. So I think we have to consider that on the one hand. What seems to be still true, which has always been true in my experience, is that video seems to perform very well for the short form content. It's great for reach, whereas audio always aces it when it comes to depth, where people really want to learn more and really get to, some deep level of conversation. They seem to gravitate towards the audio. I think my opinion, though, is that, well, where's your audience, and how do your audience like to interact with you? What sort of content would they prefer, and how would they prefer to receive it, I think is what starts to go through my mind. So I think even if you've got a very small audience, the newsletter comes back in here. You could do surveys. You could. I had just to share an experience that I had many years ago with my podcast, which was probably at the time no, it was probably over 100 episodes in, actually. I think it was probably around the 100, or if not the 200 mark. I I put a shout out, a call to action in both the newsletter and the audio to say, I want to speak to you, and invited people to fill out, I think it was a simple Google form that created a spreadsheet for me. These are the days where we use Skype a lot more. They'd leave their Skype ID or phone number, and I was expecting to have sort of 10, 15-minute conversations with a handful of listeners. I ended up having many 45, 1 hour conversations with a lot of listeners and learned so much about how my podcast fitted into their life. And as part of that kind of research, I just gained a really deep insight as to what themes and topics they were into, but what it was about the podcast. But I could also picture how the podcast, them actually listening to the podcast and how they were receiving it at that end. And there's nothing to stop anyone doing something similar to that. It's a really curiously easy thing to do. You've just got to make the time and commitment to do it. But you could do that with everything that we're talking about here, with your videos, with your blogs, with your newsletters. Ask the audience. It's that thing. Once you've got real people engaging with you, ask real people, because I think that strategy will probably trump any other kind of strategy. Talking of which, I think something that was going through my mind a moment ago was when it comes to video with audio, and I've got to be careful of my own biases here, but you need to ask yourself, are you being shiny in terms of shiny object, or are you being strategic, which is what we're talking about now, which is being sort of strategic with the relationship with your audience. So I think there's a danger that some people might get a bit wobbly doing video, or feeling they have to do video because that's what everybody else is doing. I think in this, particularly this year, it's really curious to me, this year in 2022, everything that's starting to happen now with vlogging and vodcasts is what I thought was going to happen in 2020 pre-pandemic, because the conversations I was having towards the end of 2019, I was getting asked a lot of questions about video and should we be doing our podcast on video. Then, of course, lockdown and the pandemic came along, but everyone just kind of went in different directions with hybrid working, Zoom calls, and lots of podcast audio. But now that's sort of moved, and we've moved forward a bit from that. I think what's starting to happen now is probably what would have happened a couple of years ago, which is YouTube becoming big in the space, and short form content doing well. Curiously, TikTok with podcasts. So I think there's lots of different ways you can think about this. I mean, I did used to listen to a podcast that was a video podcast, and I used to play the video in the background, but sometimes I would just switch away and look at what's going on, depending on if they were holding up a book or if there was something funny going on in the studio, and I kind of wanted to see the sort of interaction. So that's been my limited experience of watching a podcast. But I think that most people that choose to use podcasts to educate or entertain themselves are deep thinkers. The research shows, that it's interesting. Actually, it's coming back more towards this. Edison Research did some interesting studies a few years ago, actually quite a few years ago, with podcasts, and that revealed that most podcast listeners were either highly affluent and or highly educated.
That's still the case now with the research that they're still
exactly
doing.
And I would have argued against that over the last few years, saying the demographics have really changed. It's a much broader appeal now. But actually, to Mark's point, now I've read some recent research again, which I think, curiously, and I also, you've got to take this with a pinch of salt, but I did read an article the other day that said 51% of listeners on 51% of podcast listeners in America, their average household income was over $250,000.
Wow.
So and I'm a little bit skeptical about that. Is that, are people are answering those surveys aspirationally, or how truthfully they're answering those questions? But I think that that's not the only piece of information I've read. But to Mark's point, I think it's not the income or the wealth that's important. It's the fact that it's the mindset. It's the sort of the type of people that are choosing to listen to podcasts. And if you go and put all your time and resources into video, and that's not where they are, then that's where you'll come unstuck.
Another thing I think that's important in that whole discussion is that, especially when we look at the big research into podcasts and podcast listening, so much of that is informed by the sort of less than 1% of the actual podcast ecosystem,
Mm.
because it's informed by the shows that those diary entry writing survey respondents are actually listening to, which are the big shows. They are the, My Favorite Murder, or Conan O'Brien Needs a Friend, or all these different shows, all the BBC shows, a lot of the big ACAST shows as well. And so you can tell by sort of listening to the adverts for a lot of those things, you can get a sense of the affluence. Like, I know how much a Casper mattress costs, and it's not in my budget. But I think when we look at a lot of the behavior and all that kind of stuff, a lot of it is geared towards a very different kind of podcast listening, and a lot of the advice as well, I think, is geared towards that. I think the point of video, I just want to quickly tie off, is I think I am absolutely not against video. I just think it needs a bit of a sober sort of thinking. One of the things, like to Rob's point about short form, is you can do some really fun and interesting things without having to have a camera recording you. There's a show I produce. It's about fashion, and she's got a team working with her, and they make. She will record a custom sort of piece, like a bit like a trailer for an episode, that goes out on TikTok and Instagram, and it's got B-roll footage and bits of music and things like that, that they can put together fairly quickly, and it allows them to then showcase and encourage people to check out the podcast. It doesn't necessarily mean you have to then record the whole thing in video and worry about, because again, sorry, very quickly, but like, again, in the real world, we've got to think about, well, are our guests comfortable with putting the camera on? Is it going to look okay? Or are we going to get the old shots of just, it's everything up the nose or whatever? Do they really want to do that? And that's something that we have to think about, when we're making video. Whereas there are other things that you can do. And the very last, very quick point is possibly counter to all of this, is that YouTube is making such a big, they really want to jump properly into podcasting. And it's going to be very much a watch this space to see what happens over the next year, I think, because they are really getting interested in not just static images and audio being uploaded, but like making youtube.com, the website, a full-on destination for people to get their podcasts. So I think that's going to be interesting to see what that does.
If I could add to Mark's points there, just to share a bit of my experience with you, just and beginning with the last point there about YouTube. You definitely have to watch this space. It's always been curious to me that Google have had a podcasts manager for many years, but they've never really done anything big in the podcasting space. That never really took off. That's one thing. The other thing is, I remember pre-pandemic going to various podcast shows around the UK, and having a very sort of indie vibe, very independent. And then going to the podcast show earlier this year, with my friend Matt Cheney, and it was really interesting. All the big guys there, BBC, YouTube had a really big presence there, and I thought, now this is interesting. They're a video platform, and so I think that where this is going, and I'm pretty confident they're going to have an audio only channel, which is part of YouTube in some shape or form. So that's kind of what I think is going to happen. By the way, Apple had that for many years. I don't know if you remember, but iTunes used to have a video version as well as an audio version, and they were all called podcasts. And I wonder if it's going to possibly be a version or an iteration of that. I don't know. The other thing to look for that has just appeared on YouTube is a community tab, which you probably know more about than I do, Simon, but I know that obviously you can leave comments under videos, but community, I imagine, allows you to post things and interact with people on your channel. And so I think there's coming back to what we were talking about earlier in terms of engagement, I think that, that there's a lot that's going on in that space. To Mark's earlier point, though, and I think you just have to be honest with yourself. If a video podcast is video, okay, it might have a microphone and a pair of headphones in the picture, but you're still doing video. So don't kid yourself that it's a podcast being filmed, which of course it is, but it's still video. You need to think about lighting, software, time, resources, equipment, approach, know-how. And to do all of that, you'd have to do the same as what you would have to do if you were creating a video for a teaching series, for example, or something like that. And again, how you do anything is how you do everything. If you're the sort of person that wants a credible brand, you want to do the video in a way that reflects your brand and the sort of values that you have. So I think you can have a podcast interview and that can be filmed, but it's still video. So you still have to go through a lot of the processes and learning skills and all of that. That would be my approach, is to approach that video, call it a podcast or a podcast on that's filmed, whatever you want to call it, but it's still video. So you still need that sort of mindset, I think. And audio is audio. So I'd be, treat them sort of, they can kind of work together in their own sort of symbiotic ecosystem, but I do. It is a different set of skills. And this is where my clients get unstuck. It's a different budget. It's a different set of resources. And when I talk about budget, I mean in terms of time as well. It's a whole new thinking pattern that you can't treat lightly if you're going to do it well. So just what's working really well for the people I work with at the moment. We were talking off air beforehand about Riverside and those platforms that will film a conversation with a remote guest. What seems to be working really well, and I'd be interested to know, Mark, if this is true for the folks that you work with, is they film the whole thing. They film the whole conversation. They'll publish the full length audio on the platforms, and then they might take a clip of the video for the reach and then post that to YouTube, TikTok, YouTube Shorts, of course, and that sort of thing. So that seems to be working really well at the moment. And that seems to sit well for most of the folks I work with, who are probably biased towards the audio because that's where their audience is, the CEO on the golf course with the AirPods in and that sort of thing. And they might have time over breakfast to thumb through a few clips, but they're not going to be sitting there watching video all day. They're not those kinds of people. So the type of people I work with would use video content in that kind of way. My final point of Mark's points here to give away a tip is that I think that when you're if you're going to do a video podcast, don't avoid being on Spotify and Apple and the major platforms. There was a really interesting how would you sort of phenomena, I suppose, that happened in the music industry a few years ago, which is the record labels were set, the songs that were most popular online also had a physical copy that you could buy in a store. So if the physical copy existed, there was much higher interaction in terms of the online version, the digital version of that particular record or single, right? And I see a similar sort of thing, not quite on that scale, but a similar sort of thing happening with podcasts and video podcasts. If you've got a video podcast that's just on YouTube, you're probably not going to get quite the same result as you would if it's a credible podcast that's also featured on Apple and Spotify. Even though you might do really well on YouTube and have lots of plays, if you like, or downloads, and even not that many on Apple and Spotify, I think listeners get a sort of sense, it's a credibility thing. They get the impression that you're a bona fide podcast if you're also on those platforms and you show their icons in your video. So just a little tip there.
Yeah, there definitely is an element of credibility there. And I think just to sort of close down on the video side of things, if we loop back into some audio, I wanted to share, Leanne has shared that The Diary of a CEO does a great video podcast. And yes, indeed, they do. I would say, though, that the budget for that podcast is astronomical. I mean, like, you're talking multicam. They've got a dolly camera, which is a camera that slides around. I mean, it's TV production levels. So with the amount of money they're putting in and the level of guests they've got, I would argue that they probably make a very good podcast version of a TV interview, as opposed to it being a video podcast. But I certainly appreciate your comment, Leanne. That is probably, the bar is set incredibly high from Mr. Bartlett there. And then Leanne also said that she's adding different content to different formats, which I think is quite interesting. So saying recording the full interview with the guests on YouTube and then creating a highlights version for the podcast, which I think is an interesting way round of doing it. You could also go the other way around, which would work just as well. As we've said, you can use tools like Riverside, and I use Riverside when I'm recording my podcasts. And that is because the guests I'm talking to are generally nowhere near each other on a different side of the world. They've never met, and actually now we're all used to Zoom. They just like being able to see each other, and Riverside gives us that opportunity. And generally they're in a very sort of not particularly interesting looking office, and a lot of them are sort of hunched over the computer and talking into the mic, being very well behaved. Podcast guests is really good, so the video is often unusable, but that element of being able to see and interact and take those little reads off of people, I think, is what can make a podcast sound more natural than if it's just audio. Obviously, there's definitely an argument for the other way, where you can't see them and it is a bit radio and it is a bit telephone, and obviously that's something you'd have to sort of feel your way around. We've had a couple of questions, I think, really about sort of getting started. So obviously what we've covered so far is sort of platforms to help you engage, so kind of once you've got an episode up, but maybe we could think a little bit more about this sort of style of episode, or sort of how's a sort of manageable way to get started. So I would say, from my point of view, if you're already making some content, so if you're already writing a blog or you're hosting a regular webinar, for example, so you're already used to talking and creating some content, then you've kind of already got something to talk about. And what you can do is create a podcast, and you could either do a read through of that or read aloud of that blog, but you could also interview someone about that topic. And there's kind of different styles, I guess, of what it ends up like. But I think from an idea point of view, it's often a case of just open up your email inbox and see the last few questions that you got asked by clients. Could you record that as an answer? Could you write a blog which is in answer to that question? So I think just from sort of topic wise, I think most people do have something to sort of write about. It's just a case of unpicking where that is hiding in plain sight often. But Mark, in terms of, let's say, sort of getting started, because I know you've sort of worked in this space before in terms of with clients on this topic, is there a sort of summary that you would give to someone who's thinking of starting?
Yeah. Okay. So I would start with, as we would with any kind of endeavor, is starting with in this case, the listener in mind, and figuring out who they are, and how they're going to benefit from spending 20 minutes, half an hour, 40 minutes with you. What are they going to take away, not necessarily from each episode, but what is the main benefit of your podcast? And another thing that is interesting to think about at the moment is, what are ways that we can add value. So I have a newsletter which I'm playing around with a podcast version, and I'm trying to make my life as easy as possible because I want to make this sustainable. So one of the things that I'm doing is, it is just me reading the newsletter, but I want to be able to add value, because I want those juicy email subscribers, but I also do want to provide listening audible pleasure for those who want to listen. So what I'm trying to do is, I'm trying to think about how can I add a little bit of value so that you get something that's in this in version A of the product, if you like, and something in version B. So with the podcast, yes, it's you can just have it read to you, but also when I can, I'm getting little audio memos from people. So this is a newsletter that's about 60 seconds of a particular piece of audio. And so what I'll do is, I'll try and get a hold of the producer or someone who was involved in making that 60 seconds and ask them a couple of questions, and just say, get your phone out, or however is easy for you, and record, a minute or two of you just chatting to me about what this was. And that's easy because I'm working a couple of weeks in advance. I'm not having to sit them down with an interview. We're not having to get onto Riverside or coordinate calendars. They can do it when they feel, you know, when it's convenient for them, and then I can just kind of slot it in and make it super easy, and then it's done. And so I'm trying to think specifically, really always thinking about the experience of the person who's going to be interacting with this content, because and it's very easy for us, and I think especially when we think about the creator economy, so much, or all the advice around creators is around us as creators. And so what can we do? What can we sort of push out to people? And how are all the different ways that we can make our thing happen into people's ears and eyes and everything else? Whereas if we can start by looking at things the other way and just thinking about how we can serve our audience in a way that is easy for us and is engaging for us, but is ultimately going to impact them, and build that relationship that we want to build. So so going back to to your question half an hour ago, I think it's starting off by thinking really about the person who's going to interact and finding ways that you can add a little value, but see this as a relationship that you're building.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Rob, have you got anything you want to add to that?
I think there was some great stuff in there, actually, Mark. I mean, there's all sorts of different approaches. My mind goes in a slightly different direction when asked that question, which I hope would add more value to what Mark was saying, which is, I think it does actually lean upon a lot of what Mark was saying in terms of the experience of the recipient of your sort of content creation and what they're going to experience. But I think maybe because when I think about podcasts these days, I tend to think more strategically, and the folks that I work with tend to think about audio strategically in the same way that I do, and that doesn't mean they're necessarily structured in every other area of their life, which is also true for me as well. True messy creator in that sense. But when it comes to a podcast, manage to sort of pin it down into some sort of nice shape or form that's a kind of a strategic framework, if you like. So with that in mind, I mean, some of the tips that I give people when they're first starting out a podcast is, I mean, the first thing is just start. Just get used to recording and being in record, because it's a different experience for you sharing a story or an idea when you know that red light is on. It's that red light fever thing. And the way that stuff comes out will come out differently. Your mind rewires itself as it starts sharing that. So get used to that experience, and then take the brave step of listening back to it, and then doing some self curation. You don't have to share this with the world. Just give yourself some sort of blunt critical feedback and say, right, okay, perhaps labored on about that. Maybe this is a good thing I could explore further, and that sort of thing. So put a little bit of time in and do that. Just get started with whatever you've got. I often get asked lots of questions about equipment, but my general principle behind that is upgrade when you need to. So always get the best that you can and buy for life if you can, but you don't really need to upgrade until you know you've got a problem, that you've hit a ceiling and you can't get past that until you've got this bit of kit. I do meet people who have spent a lot of money on equipment and they bought completely the wrong equipment for the wrong reasons, either the room or the format. It's like, it always baffles me now. I mean, it's easy to say this now with experience, but why you would start a podcast with, or why you would buy a load of equipment when you don't even know what type of podcast you're making, because the type of podcast, whether it's an interview series or a remote interview series, or you're recording people in a field, will determine the kind of equipment you want to buy. But back to the content thing, there was a great question just a moment ago about how to narrow down your topic. So my general principle for podcasts these days is go very, very deep and very, very narrow. That's what listeners love. And then you can sort of like experiment with this. And how you would experiment with this is, for example, sketch out 10 episodes for a first season, right? And they can be overarching. So think about a journey that you would ordinarily take somebody on. Okay. Start, middle, end. It's like, how to start a podcast. Okay. Break that down into 10 episodes. And there might be an episode on equipment. There might be an episode on on delivery. There might be an episode on uploading, on publishing, production, editing. We'll just break it down. An easy way to do this, by a little cheat here: go onto Amazon, find a book if you can that's a bestseller on the niche or topic that you're exploring, and have a look at the chapter headings, and then pinch those. They could be your episode titles for your first series. It's sort of overarching journey. What's the journey somebody else would take you on? Now, here's a really cool thing. Once you've made and published that season, even if you've only got a few listeners, you can see some numbers, and some episodes are going to do better than the other. Now, the ones that do better than the others could be a whole season themselves. So take that one episode and make a whole season out of just that. That's how you get narrower and narrower, and see how it goes. And if it works really, really well, you're in the right direction. If it's not kind of panning out as well, pick the next one and then just do a whole season on that. And to Mark's point there of sort of A/B testing, that's how you do this over the longer term. And the truth is that podcasts are about the long term. This is a long-term game. You can't achieve anything quickly with a podcast. So be in it for the longer haul. But you could achieve what I've just described over the course of a year. And most people, by the way, will be here in a year's time. I think it's something like the statistic is like 3% of those that say they're going to start a podcast actually do. So most people will be sat here in a year's time still thinking about it, still thinking about which topic to choose. And they could have just done all of that, So, they're the sorts of things that I think about when getting started.
Can I just add one
yes,
thing
please,
because just to because I loved all that, especially the Amazon thing. That's phenomenal. One of the things that I'm again like following my nose on is how can we approach this rather than another string to another element of the brand or another sort of content channel, is actually look at it as a hobby. And take the joy and the creativity and the time, because if you have a real, honest to goodness hobby, you are quite happy and willing to invest time and money. I'm not a good guitarist, but I keep buying guitars because I keep getting a little bit better and going, okay, I've outgrown this thing now and I need to get a little bit better or whatever. And I'll sit, at night and have a noodle on the guitar. If you can approach this with that joy, rather than it feel, okay, I've got to, now it's content creation time. Now I've got to do the podcast. Is and actually part of what that potentially allows you to do is remove some of the pressure and remove some of the brand pressure from it as well. It can just be something where you get to, because if you have a business or an organization that is fueled by the things that you are interested in, then the podcast gets to do that as well. This doesn't have to be the podcast that is branded to your thing. It could just be another way that you get to talk about the stuff that you're interested in. That's what's working for me at the moment. That's what's keeping my creativity juices sort of going. And yeah, I just think there's a way that we can look at this with a bit more joy, but still absolutely keeping that, like, being strategic about it, but not being too precious or putting too much pressure on yourself. But yeah, like, just start, I think, is also a really good.
I think definitely that is. I think we've had a couple of questions just around the time element of it, so I'll sort of dive in with a couple of bits there. So in terms of a great question here, how long is a series? How many episodes? It really as many as you want. Podcasts, pick your own format. You're making it for you at the beginning. As Rob has said, this is about getting to know you, your voice, the way you articulate things, and for sharing if you want to. But you could make 5 episodes, 4 episodes, 6 episodes just for you, with the intention of not releasing any of them. And then when you find out you're secretly much better at it than you thought you were, you can edit them and release them all. And that's a nice, happy thing. I think in terms of another question we've had, which was about the time budget. So how long does it take? Again, that is going to depend quite a lot on how good you are at talking, how good you are at making your point, how quick you are at making your point, and then how much editing you want to do. So, for example, you could write down 2 bullet points and ad-lib a 25-minute episode. and then think in the edit, oh, actually, there's only about 4 minutes in that. I just said the same thing 12 times. Whereas some people I know, I don't know them, but Seth Godin, for example, you can put him in front of a camera, hit record, and he will give you unique gold for 25 minutes until you say, thanks, Seth, and off he goes. Like, it's unbelievable. You don't need to edit anything he says because he's just been doing it for 20, 25, maybe 30 years. When you first start out, though, you're not going to be like your Stephen Bartlett, your Seth Godins. You're going to be a bit more, do I really mean that? Am I thinking this? Is that really? Oh, shit. I don't think I've spelt that right. Oh, no one can read it. All this thought is going to come out when you first start recording. So definitely get used to listening back, as Rob said, and editing. Or my favorite is just, sod it, I'll start again. and straight from the top, just back to the top. It's only your own sort of I suppose detail scale that's going to define how much you want to. There's a podcast I listen to which is basically unedited. The only thing they do is add sound effects, and they add stupid noises over names and people they can't talk about. They don't edit anything out. It's really funny, but you feel like you're in the room with them, and that is the vibe of the podcast. Versus something like, let's use Stephen Bartlett because it's been mentioned in the chat. That is polished to perfection. The pauses, the back and forth is timed, it's edited, it's really so you've got two ends of the scale there. And Chatterbix is the podcast, if anybody's curious. That is a rabbit hole you will never come out of if you get into that. It's a daily podcast, you've been warned. Yes, so in terms of I say, guess, frequency and time, it really is up to you, which I know isn't maybe particularly the answer you were expecting or wanting, but basically you could spend a day a week making a podcast episode and it would be amazing, I'm sure. However, you could also spend an hour making a 10-minute episode, or you could spend 11 minutes making a 10-minute episode if you get really good at it. But I think it's just have some fun with it. As Mark says, unleash the creativity. Don't assume it's going to be too perfect when you get going. Just give it a go. Maybe send it to a couple of friends, a couple of clients even, perhaps. Get them to have a listen to it and say, do I get to the point quick enough with this? Or, is this me rambling, or is this interesting? You can be open with feedback in a trusted space before you hit that post button. And then as soon as you are ready to go, there's numerous tools out there where you can share your podcast. I will post under the replay of this video a link to a list I have of podcast tools and equipment and stuff that you can use to understand how to get started with microphones, headphones, but also some tools which I've sort of curated over. And also, if Mark and Rob have any resources they'd like to throw into that mix of equipment, we'll chuck all those under as well. And I'm conscious of the time. We have somehow been rambling on about podcasts for an entire hour. How about that? There we go. It's easily done. It's easily done. So yes, in terms of connection, you're here on LinkedIn and we are all listed as speakers. So do connect with us, message us, feel free to reach out to us on LinkedIn. I will also post links to Mark and Rob's websites in the comments underneath the replay. And also thank you very much, everybody, for bearing with us, because I know this went live in a different place than everyone was expecting, but we managed to rectify that about 5 minutes in. So thanks very much for bearing with us. I'm going to log straight off of this and do a short video about the mistake I made about going live on Restream. I will also be sending it to Restream support department. So yeah, good fun. But this is the fun of it, right? This is the fun. And obviously, this will be a podcast version. And we also put this up on YouTube as well, just because we also have a YouTube channel. So we're definitely going to, eat our own dog food and repurpose the hell out of this episode. So thanks very much, Mark. And thanks very much, Rob, for joining us.
Thank you, Simon.
It's been a pleasure.
It's been good fun, hasn't it? Thank you very much, everybody, for listening and watching. We'll see you next time.